We're all back, we're ready to go, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Patrick Kincaid, author of the Continuity Girl. Thank you for giving me a tongue twister of a title. I met Patrick through Unbound. We were both crowdfunding together, weren't we? And
yeah, same
so
time.
One of the beauties of the Unbound community, that of those who don't know, Unbound is a crowdfunding author, so we authors have to persuade everybody we know and everybody we don't know to fund our work, and it's quite a grueling experience, but made a lot better by the wonders of the Unbound Social Club and the mutual support that authors have had. So Patrick and I had quite a similar journey to publication, and did a lot of kind of shared support during that time. Oh, and Patrick's getting up and going again. So I was delighted when his novel The Continuity Girl came out, and really enjoyed reading it, and it's a really lovely read and reminds me very much of The Detectorist. We have this lovely obsessive character who is convinced that Loch Ness Monster exists and is prepared to spend hours and hours and hours sitting in a van looking at the lake, and then on the kind of what I think is lovely about this novel is it captures the kind of grainy grittiness of Britain in the 60s, compared to this kind of amazing experience of this American crew coming to film Billy Wilder's film in Loch Ness, and the romance of that, and then in that romance, the romance with the Continuity Girl, and then that's lovely. It's beautifully counterpoised with modern day and the film critic who's looking to find the film. So I'm going to hand you over to Patrick, who can tell you about the writing influences, or the filmic influences of that book, and his love of cinema, which I know is very deep. So over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, thank you. I was really, I remember when you first mentioned or made the comparison with Detectorist, I was very happy with that and very flattered by that. I actually watched that for the first time when I'd finished writing the novel, and I'd gone up in the summer holidays in August back to Drumnadrochit and various other places around Loch Ness to just make sure I'd got all the details right. So I'd looked at some of the places that the novel was set, and I discovered some of the places where they shot the film, and Google Maps was my friend there. I found some places that nobody had identified yet, and that was fun. But in the evenings we'd watch Detectorists, and I felt like that was something that spoke to me and was similar to some of the situations, particularly sort of male obsessions, I think, with details of things that I really enjoy in that series. You know, if they ever made a film, Mackenzie Crook wanted to direct it, that would be good. That'd be good. I'd go with that. I'm going to start with a reading. So I'll start with right at the beginning of it, because we start with the description of a film being shown, and it's the film The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. So this is right at the beginning, and we're in 2013 at this point. Holmes is pensive. He leans on the shoulder of the fireplace and addresses Watson directly. Madame Valadon isn't in the shot. We've come across this situation before, he says. We have? Watson stops fidgeting in his borrowed kilt. Where? Holmes moves towards the open casement of the window. Through it we see a sliver of moonlit loch and the dim outline of mountains. At the ballet. The ballet? Holmes gestures outside. There's a lake and there's a castle and there's a swan that isn't really a swan. David's hand is on Gemma's thigh again. Projected light glints off his glasses, but otherwise he's invisible to her. It's like he's both Holmes and Watson in the scene that's just been referenced, the one set at the ballet. He's bored and horny at the same time. He's also shattering her willing suspension of disbelief, pulling her out of the Victorian Scotland that's being shown on the screen and dropping her into a cinema in Islington in the 21st century. That's something she won't tolerate. She raps the five-fingered beast on its knuckles until it slips off the black nylon, retreating to its shadowy lair. There's a swan that isn't really a swan, she thinks. Holmes is standing at the foot of the four-poster bed now, Madame Valadon gazing up at him from under the sheets with large, frightened eyes. Or in this case, a monster that isn't really a monster. So when I started writing The Continuity Girl, I had the idea of this film being at the centre of it, The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes. But actually, while I was writing it, other films were drawn in, or I sort of naturally, sort of organically, they just sort of joined the gang. And I think one of the good things about doing the crowdfunding with Unbound is that part of what you're asked to do is while you're doing it is to write about the artistic process a little bit and tell people about what you're doing and where you are in the process through updates. They called it, when we started, it was the Writer's Shed, and they changed the name of it partway through. They abandoned that and it just became updates rather prosaically. But I really enjoyed that. One of the things that allowed me to do actually was think about what I was doing and think about maybe some of the wider resonances and think about and answer questions actually that came up, like, you know, how do you get your crazy ideas? And I was actually able to answer this quite easily. I know that some time ago, I think around 2011, 2012, I heard an edition of the film program on Radio 4 with Matthew Sweet, and he was talking about continuity girls. The continuity supervisors on films, which in mid-century were always called continuity girls. There were always seemed to be women. They were rarely girls by any stretch of the imagination. They were usually fairly mature, actually. And I think the stimulus to this program was a film called My Week with My Week with Marilyn, which some of you might have seen, somebody might have seen, which is a film about the making of The Prince and the Showgirl. Laurence Olivier starred, and Marilyn Monroe was his co-star, and they didn't get on very well, and it's a film that divides opinion as well, but it's an interesting story. And the continuity girl on the film was someone called Elaine Shreyek, who was a veteran at that time and is still with us. And she's well into her 90s now. And Matthew Sweet interviewed her, and obviously it was already a story, it was already a film, but the idea of the continuity girl as somebody who was our way into the story about a film stuck in my mind, and I was thinking about that. I was wondering whether there was something else, some other filmic story I could tell. And then a couple of years later, I was on honeymoon, 2013, and Heather and I went on our honeymoon to Loch Ness. We stayed in Drumnadrochit, and towards the end of the week, we went on a boat tour, and we were in the middle of the loch. We were well away from the pier where we had started when the tour guide told us that what he was going to be talking about for the next 40 minutes was the Loch Ness Monster. And I have to say, my heart sank. I thought, I was hoping perhaps for something a little bit more, maybe some natural history and some geology and you know, have the sites pointed out to us. And I thought, oh no, we're stuck in the middle of this loch with somebody who believes in the Loch Ness Monster and is going to do everything he can to persuade us that the Loch Ness Monster is real. He was quite grumpy as well. He was quite grumpy because we were the only people who turned up for this tour. It was a big boat and there was lots of room for other people. It was raining a little. And actually, when we had met him in the car park outside the Tourist Information Centre in Drumnadrochit, he took one look at us and said, we'll wait a bit and see if it's worth our while. And then for some reason, he decided it was. So he took us out. It became clear quite quickly that that he was quite an interesting character, that he'd been there for 40 years, over 40 years. He'd been there since the 60s. And he had seen several phases of investigations of Loch Ness. And he had begun as a member of the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau. And what they did was point a camera at the loch, and for hours and hours and hours, with really good quality film, 35mm film, color film. And the reason they did that was because they were very aware that all of this supposed evidence for the Loch Ness Monster that there'd been so far was horrible grainy images with little information in them, really. And were easily dismissed as not very good evidence. So they wanted the best evidence they could possibly have. So that's why they were doing this. But I think that partly sparked something. I was already thinking about, well, this is film. And then at the end, he asked us whether either of us had any questions. And because the Loch Ness Monster hadn't been anything I'd been thinking about, it's very strange. I'd gone to Loch Ness, but I hadn't been thinking about the Loch Ness Monster at all. And so the only question I could think of was about one of my favorite films, which is The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, a late era Billy Wilder film, and a film I know that is not well known, is known to a few people who are into culty things, and was considered a failure at the time. And I knew about this fact that lots of it was missing, that the producers had ordered Billy Wilder to cut an hour from it. So I knew about these things, and I was interested in that. So I asked him, and I knew that they'd filmed it. Crucially, I knew they'd filmed it on location. So I asked if he'd been around while they'd filmed it, and he laughed and told me with absolute glee that he had been there when the model Loch Ness Monster had been launched and had within minutes sunk without a trace. And he was still pleased about it. It still tickled him that this had happened and that he'd seen it. And I knew then. I knew then that there was a novel in this, and I think I knew. I think because I was on honeymoon, it was going to be a romantic comedy. Nothing else was going to be. So funnily enough, I still sat on it for a couple of years. I didn't start writing it till 2015, but then it did write itself very quickly. Especially when the next element that I came up with was the framing narrative, which has the big MacGuffin in it, which is this idea that they find a complete cut of the private life of Sherlock Holmes. There's snippets of it that still exist. It's very frustrating for people who love this film, because there are scenes that exist without sound. There is audio that exists without the photography, without the visuals, and there is a working script, so we know what was in all of the film. And there are attempts to sort of splice these things together and produce something that is like the 3-hour roadshow movie that Billy Wilder had wanted to produce. I mean, what happened at the time was that was becoming an old-fashioned form. It's the form that Ben-Hur was in, and The Sound of Music, these long films that would have theatrical runs in cinemas, and they'd be treated like a visit to the theatre. There'd be intervals, and there would be people would dress up for them. That was what was expected as well. And their time was coming to an end. There was a film, as anybody know, the I think 1967 film of Dr. Dolittle with Rex Harrison. This was one of these films. These big, quite very expensive roadshow productions, and it was a failure. And I think what the studio they saw that and thought that was a comparable film because it was a period piece and a British subject as well. And they thought, well, we're not going to do that. So they ordered an hour cut from it. And it, by all accounts, Billy Wilder supervised the cut. At least he did have the final cut. And I think what you get is this. What you get is a tremendous film. What you get is a really interesting film that hangs together really well. It isn't what it was originally going to be. It isn't a very episodic series of adventures, which would have been bound to be called episodic by critics, which is, always a pejorative term. So it would have been called that, and would have been dated. Without doubt, would have been a much dated film than it is now. But because it doesn't exist, because this film doesn't exist, it becomes a holy grail. And there's a book, I should have brought it over actually. There's a book by Roger Lewis that I read as research called Stage People, and there's a long interview in it with Robert Stevens, who plays Sherlock Holmes in the film, and who I saw late in his career. He had a comeback. I saw him as King Lear and Falstaff late in his career, and he's a fantastic stage actor, and he was at the time. He was considered the new Olivier at the time. So, which is why Billy Wilder brought him into the film. He told him he wanted him to play Sherlock Holmes as though he were playing Hamlet. And the interview with Roger Lewis. Roger Lewis is another big fan of the film, and he talks about the film in this interview. This film that doesn't exist, not the cut that we have, but the cut that might have been. And the way he talks about it, it isn't only Billy Wilder's greatest film. It isn't only the greatest film of the 60s or something. It's the greatest film ever made. And I think this was something I thought about a lot. You can say that about something that doesn't exist, and it doesn't exist. You can say this is the greatest film that ever existed. And I felt there was something similar about this holy grail nature of this film, this unobtainable nature of this film, and the Loch Ness Monster, and these people who are looking for the Loch Ness Monster, and all they're finding is a blank space. All they're finding is a space where there is no monster. But they might find something else. Tomorrow they might find something that tells them about the Loch Ness Monster. Tomorrow they might find something that explains how there can be a Loch Ness Monster when there isn't enough fish in the loch to feed anything very big. When the fact that the reason for that is because the loch is a huge expanse of suspension of peat, and because of that, light doesn't penetrate very far. Because of that, you can't have the microscopic life that you need that will feed a population of fish that would feed a large animal. It just doesn't exist. But tomorrow you might find something that turns that on its head. So they keep going at it. So I thought there was something about those things that meant that I could tell a story, these parallel stories. So that's what I went with. it also meant I could set something in the 60s and I could set something now, and I could make the 60s, I could make people behave in the 60s as they would in the 60s without ever having to apologize for it, because there was the context was sort of built in. So I could, so I didn't have to worry about that, which was nice. And I could make that, I could give that a fairly ordinary 3-act romantic comedy structure, but then place that within, well, actually within a story that's not very romantic, that actually goes in the other direction. So I could do that as well. I was quite pleased I could do that. But as I was saying, there were other things. There were other films that crept in, and the first of those, because I had my 2013, 2014 main character is a film studies lecturer, and she's interested in contemporary films as well as older films. And so I have her go with her boyfriend on her birthday to the cinema. And this is a cinema, this is my favorite cinema in the country. This is the Genesis on the Mile End Road. And I saw a few films here. I didn't see this film. I saw this film, which is, that she goes to see, which is Jonathan Glazer's Under the Skin. I saw this at the Electric in Birmingham, which is another great cinema, another fantastic cinema. And I thought of this because it's set in Scotland, and I wanted some contrast with the Scotland that we see, because the Scotland we see in 1969, I have Jim, the hero in that part of the story, I have him say in 2014, looking back, that that Scotland, or the Highlands anyway, in 1969 might as well have been 1959. You know, and I wanted it to reflect, you know, how small it is, how small a world it is, and then you have this Hollywood world come in. You also have them looking out actually a lot further than Scotland and a lot further than Hollywood even, because you have them looking at the moon landing. So we have that happening during the story as well. But I was pleased when I came up with, when I saw Jonathan Glazer's film, because it gave me another way of talking about Scotland and another bit of contrast. So I'm going to read a little bit about this film, what I've written about it, and then say something about what I learned by writing this. So David is standing outside the cinema, dressed in exactly what a wardrobe assistant would hand out to an extra playing second university lecturer. He's swiping at the screen of his phone. "You're late, Dr. MacDonald," he says, pushing his horn rims back up his nose. "By 5 minutes, Dr. Kitch." She tiptoes to kiss him. "Haven't gotten tickets yet. You didn't tell me what you wanted to see." She'd meant to reply to his text after her lecture, but when the time came, had rushed off to Mum and Dad's instead. "Why don't you choose?" He plumps for Jonathan Glazer's new film, Under the Skin. From what she's heard, it isn't really a date movie. But then the ordinary rules don't apply when you're a couple of film studies lecturers. It isn't long before Gemma is certain he's made the right choice. The opening sequence, with its nerve-tautening score and half-abstract imagery, sets up an air of menace that's maintained throughout. Scarlett Johansson's casting turns out not to be the stunt she had anticipated, but another one altogether. She's playing a man-eating alien, or perhaps something inorganic, some sort of shape-shifted AI, a monster in any event, sent to lure ordinary blokes into her white van. But oddly, she's never looked more human. Her flesh is properly fleshy, rather than that rubber foam material most movie flesh seems to be. And she's showing a lot of it too, pretty much all, in fact. But the real surprise is that she isn't even the film's star. That turns out to be Scotland, all of it. It's as though Glazer meant to strip the country barer than he strips his Hollywood leading lady. Of course, there are shots of pine-bristling mountains, their misty peaks reflected in the glassy lochs below. But before you get to them, you have to negotiate a Scotland that rarely gets screen time. The seamier streets of Glasgow, the post-industrial wastelands at its centre and edges, and the new build estates of Tiki-Taki that spell out onto the fringes of open heath. Sometimes Gemma's half aware that the trance she's in owes as much to boredom as to rapture. But then there are scenes she knows she'll never forget. That one set on the beach, for instance, with the family, their dog, and the turbulent sea, is among the most terrifying things she has seen in a cinema. She knows it will give her nightmares for weeks. By the time she and David leave the auditorium with the scant others who have been in there with them, she's convinced she's seen a masterpiece. Well, says David, taking off his glasses and blinking, that's 2 hours of my life I'll never get back. For a moment, Gemma is bewildered. Then she remembers who she's with and laughs. Oh, it was a bit arty for you, wasn't it? He shrugs. If by arty you mean boring as fuck. She takes his arm and gives it a squeeze. Well, I'll let you choose the takeaway too. Take your time though, yeah? No point being disappointed twice. Sorry, I forgot there was a swear in that. Yeah, that was interesting because I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed writing something that wasn't a review of a film, but was a description of a film that added something to the texture of the rest of the novel, and added some contrast to the other films I'm talking about, but also actually gave us a Scotland we don't see elsewhere in the novel, you know, and that was interesting. Now I don't think I'm not the only person who's done this, and I know I'm not. One of the people I contacted very early, in fact, before I submitted the novel to Unbound, I contacted. I can see Tabitha's asking if Malcolm Bradbury was an influence, and yes, he definitely was. In fact, I had to be told this afterwards, though. I was told afterwards that I'd written a campus novel, which I hadn't thought about. I'd been thinking about film, but it's absolutely right. It is a campus novel. There's a couple of scenes actually set on campuses, and I didn't think about that. It's one at Goldsmiths and one at Aberdeen. And so that definitely was an influence. And that 60s thing, I think I was thinking of novels by Bradbury, by Kingsley Amis, and David Lodge. There you go. I remember David Lodge as well. They're definitely there as influences, but also Jonathan Coe. And I knew Jonathan Coe was a fan of The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, so I contacted him to see if he would lend me some support when I sent the novel to Unbound, and he got back very, very quickly and was very enthusiastic. I had read fairly recently, so just before that, I'd read Number 11, which is the novel he wrote. I suppose he wrote it about 2014, 2015, and it's a sequel to What a Carve Up. What a Carve Up is a novel where a film is very important and the memory of a film is very important. It's a film that a young boy watches at an impressionable age, and it stays with him his whole life. It doesn't have a very good effect on him, actually. It has a rather bad effect on him. And that's a very satirical novel. It's a very angry novel, I would say, written in the 90s, and very angry about. It is a great novel. But another thing that happens in Number 11, there's something that I think is even more pertinent, where there's a character who is convalescing. He's ill, and he's remembering a film that he watched while he was ill as a child, and it was an arty Eastern European short that was shown on TV, such as they used to show on TV during the day. I remember this. I remember being ill and watching odd films on TV. They were actually just fillers. You know, they'd last 10 minutes, and they'd slot these in the schedule. Odd cartoons as well. Odd Eastern European cartoons would pop up occasionally as well. Now, actually, they're too easy to find now. You put them into Google and you'll find these odd films. You know, it'll take a bit of investigation, but you'll find them. Then you can watch them on YouTube. But for years, you couldn't do that. You know, you'd have these memories of them. And I think the way that that films you watch as a child become memories. You remember them in odd ways, and you don't quite remember them in the right way either. I think you bring things, because with films you always bring things to them. I was interested in that as well, and I think this film, Under the Skin, has a dreamlike quality anyway. So that's something that sort of sticks with you. I think The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes is a film that I think the first time you watch it, it strikes you as very odd. It has a very strange tone. It's a comedy, but what's really odd is if somebody who loves it tells you about it, they don't tell you about the jokes. They don't tell you about it being funny. It's not what stays with you. It is a funny film. There are laughs in it. There's particularly the whole sequence towards the beginning at the ballet is very funny. But what you remember is a rather bittersweet quality. What you remember is this sort of yearning quality, which fits in with the sad story of the film itself and of the making of the film itself. And I wanted to bring something of that to the book too. So I wanted something slightly bittersweet. I knew I wanted the ending to be a Billy Wilder ending. You know, I knew I wasn't going to do it. I knew I wasn't going to get Nobody's Perfect. You know, is that the most famous last line in a film ever? You know, and that's either, it was written either by Billy Wilder or his co-writer I.A.L. Diamond, and I think they attributed it to each other all the time. But you know, and then you know they followed it up. Their follow-up film was The Apartment, Shut Up and Deal. You know, I mean, just fantastic last lines, with a note of, and the great thing about them is they're open-ended. You know, there's stuff going to happen after this. You know, things are going to carry on, and I knew I wanted that as well, and I knew I wanted it because I think that's the way films live on in people's memories. Billy Wilder's great hero was I'm going to forget his first name now, Lubitz. Anybody know? I can't remember his name. He made The Shop on the Corner, and he made romantic comedies in the 30s and 40s. He was another European emigre. He was somebody who went from Germany to America in the 30s, and his watchword was, don't tell the audience 2 + 2 = 4. Tell them 2 + 2, and then leave it completely. So he wanted to work the audience all the time, and I knew I wanted that quality from Billy Wilder. I knew I wanted something that kind of would go beyond the ending, and you'd have to kind of speculate. And Billy Wilder himself, he was asked questions at different times about what happened with Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine's characters in The Apartment. You know, did they end up together? What future did they have? And he gave different answers all the time. And he said it's because he changed his mind all the time. He still didn't know, he didn't know at the time. And sometimes he thought it would go one way and sometimes another. He didn't actually know. So I thought that was a quality that I wanted in it as well. How are we doing for time, Virginia? Can't hear you.
10 minutes. 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Would people, do people have questions, or would you want another reading, or what would you like? Do you think? Ernst, I think it is Ernst, yeah. I think that's right. I do have, what I thought, I began with, by telling you about this, this trip on Loch Ness I had with this Loch Ness monster. His name is Dick Raynor. If you look up Dick Raynor, Raynor, his exhaustive log of searching for the Loch Ness monster is all online. He has a modern and very dry sense of humour, which is interesting too, and doesn't suffer fools gladly. I don't think he'd suffer me gladly, so I don't know what he thinks of the Continuity Girl. But I thought I would, because of that, because of his glee at watching the fate of the model Loch Ness monster, I thought I'd read that bit where that happens in the novel. So I'll just find that. I'll skip around a little bit with this. So I have April Bloom, who's the Continuity Girl, invites Jim Outhwaite, who's the Loch Ness monster hunter, who is very ambiguous about this whole filmmaking thing, to come and see the launch of their model Loch Ness monster on the loch. So I'm going to skip around this a bit, but I'll start with the beginning of the scene. So, what do you think? April was in her jeans and t-shirt, and her hair was in plaits again. They were standing together on the next quay to Campbell Pier, a little distant from the others. It's something all right, he told her, and meant it too. Riding before them at the landing's edge was something truly monstrous, a terrible face set with a pair of angry red orbs at the end of a long and swan-like neck. Behind it, two humps, like those of a Bactrian camel, rose on its back. How big was it? 20 foot high, 30 long? Its textured exterior gave a good impression of dinosaur hide too. It was only its tendency to sway from side to side that gave the impression of a swimming gait that would be more comic than terrifying. It's the face I like best, he said, reaching for the positive. Oh yeah, said April, stuff and nightmares. He remembered now what he'd meant to ask earlier, and had forgotten because she'd brushed his hand with hers, and he hadn't known whether he was expected to take hold of it. As they'd watched the crew winch the beast out of the truck into the lock, he'd noticed that it didn't have a keel. He asked about it now. A what? A keel, he said. It ought to have one to stop it from tipping when it turns in the water. He looked at the cables attached low at the monster's bows, drooping into the water and emerging again at the stern of the powerboat, moored in front of her. Is she completely dependent on that to keep going? He asked, pointing at the boat. Far as I know, she doesn't come with oars, at least. And what they find out, sorry, I'll just cut ahead again. The humps on the back are flotation units. So if it tips over too far, it will push it back up. That's what he finds. And Jim says, I suppose it was designed by someone who knows what they're doing. Uh-huh, says April. See the guy talking with Mr. Wilder, not Mr. Diamond, the other guy. That's the special effects man, April said. She shot him a look that was part accusatory and part amused, mocking again even. If you'd bothered to go see 2001, you'd know what he can do. There were some people there he did know, of course. And so he's looking at the film crew all around. They're all ready for the monster to launch. And then Billy Wilder gives the go-ahead. Okay, it was the familiar Austro-American voice calling through the loudhailer. Let's see her go. The engine of the powerboat made a minor key roar, then sprang forward. It traveled out some 30 feet before the monster jerked to life and followed. Great surges of white water boiled at both the boats and the monster's sides, making a wide double trail. So, Mr. Monster Hunter, called the Austro-American, still amplified. There's what you've been looking for all these years. You can retire happy now, no? Jim nodded, feeling the strain of the rictus he wished he wasn't making. All eyes were on him. including those of Colin and Genevieve Page. Then everyone looked out there. They're two of the stars of the film. Then everyone looked out at the monster again. What do you really think? April murmured. Jim dipped his voice and leant towards her. One of her pigtails touched his shoulder. Don't think I'd be reaching for a disruption report sheet. It's the humps, isn't it? He nodded. They were too proud, too unlike anything that had been reported. They took too much away from the strange persuasiveness of that neck and head. So then Billy Wilder turns to him again and asks, "What do you think of the humps, Mr. Monster Hunter?" he called through the loud hailer. "Honest answer, please." Jim made a proportionally amplified shrug. "Perhaps a little too pronounced," he said. Then, to make sure he sounded as little like a critic as possible, "The neck and the head are excellent." "Many thanks, Mr. Monster Hunter." His tone was that of someone whose contention has been corroborated by an expert. "Okay, gentlemen," he called, turning the loud hailer towards the water again. "Let's get rid of them." So they remove the humps, and then the boat goes out again. "I thought that was the flotation unit," said Jim. "Yes, it is. So they can't remove it, can they?" "Tell it to Mr. Wilder," said April. "I double dare you." Even as she spoke, the monster's neck began to swing from side to side again, this time alarmingly. The swimmers shot away, using the humps like a paddling float. And then the monster found some stability. The boat moved at a steadier rate, making fewer surges now that the humps were gone, and the monster rode lower in the water. Now Jim couldn't be sure that the sight of that graceful neck wouldn't set his heart racing and send him reaching for his logbook. "Any better?" April said now. The urge to reach for her was overwhelming. "Oh yes," he said, balling his fingers, "but I want to see her turn." As the boat reached the same limits it had before, Jim could almost hear the pilot's mind working through the dilemma. Even with 30 feet of cable, too quick a turn would make the monster tilt dangerously. It was no surprise then when the boat turned shallowly instead, tracing a broad circle that pulled the monster out towards the middle of the lock. "Taking the long route, huh?" said April. Jim looked at her hand, relaxed by his side. He doesn't have a choice. Then there was a gasp from the quayside. He had to force his mind away from April to catch a glimpse of the monster's head dipping quickly to port. There was no oscillation. It simply continued to move until it was lost in the water. Instantly, the bow of the motorboat rose high. Bill could see the wetsuited diver frantically working at the stern, loosening the cables. Then the boat leveled with an audible smack. Another gasp erupted from the spectators. Behind the boat, where moments before there had been a monster, a plume of bubbles broke on the lock's surface. There you go. So how we... I can't hear you, Virginia.
I'm sorry, I was talking to my son at the door. So thank you very much. That was a great way to end, and thank you very much for those interesting insights on the films that affected the Continuity Girl. And it's very interesting to hear all that history, and particularly about Billy Wilder. And I've not heard of the film until I read your book, and it has made me think I must search it out. We're going to end there, but thank you very much, Patrick, for your time. Thank you very much for coming. As I've been saying on all the other calls I've been on, please do support local bookshops and authors by going through local bookshops, and support indie presses like Unbound